The events leading to the Battle of Krasny Bor in February 1943 were shaped by the shifting balance on the Eastern Front following the Soviet victory at Stalingrad and the German army's retreat from the Caucasus. After the encirclement and destruction of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad in late January, the Soviet High Command sought to sustain its momentum by pressing offensives along the northern sector, particularly around Leningrad. The city had been under siege since September 1941, with intermittent land and lake supply routes only partially sustaining its population. Operation Iskra in January 1943 had succeeded in opening a narrow corridor south of Lake Ladoga, enabling limited supplies and troop movements, but the Soviet command aimed to exploit this breakthrough by further driving German forces away from the city and widening the corridor. The Volkhov and Leningrad fronts were tasked with pushing westward toward Muga, Tosno, and Krasny Bor, key points along the vital rail line connecting Leningrad with the rest of the Soviet Union. Krasny Bor, located roughly 30 kilometers southeast of Leningrad, lay along the Moscow-Leningrad Railway and the crucial road to Tosno. Its control provided not only logistical value for troop movements and resupply, but also a base from which either side could threaten the flanks of the opposing forces. Defending this sector was the Spanish 250th Infantry Division, commonly known as the Blue Division, which had been deployed to the Eastern Front since October 1941. The division, composed of approximately 17,700 troops, was integrated into German Army Group North and assigned to the 18th Army's front sector near Krasny Bor. By early 1943, the division was reduced in strength due to prior engagements and the harsh winter, numbering closer to 15,000 combat-ready troops, supported by German artillery and logistical elements. Facing them was the Soviet Leningrad Front, spearheaded by the 55th Army under General Vladimir Sviridov. For the February offensive, the 55th Army deployed roughly 44,000 men, supported by more than 800 artillery pieces and mortars, as well as elements of the 122nd and 123rd Rifle Divisions, the 43rd Rifle Brigade, and several tank battalions equipped primarily with T-34s and lighter T-60 tanks. The Soviet plan was to break through the Spanish-held sector along a frontage of 12 kilometers, capture Krasny Bor within the first day, and then push toward Tosno and the Emga rail junction. The offensive was part of a broader attempt to encircle German forces south of Leningrad and further relieve the siege conditions in the city. Political and strategic considerations also influenced the forthcoming clash. For Germany, holding Army Group North's positions was critical not only for maintaining the siege of Leningrad, but also for preventing the Red Army from breaking into the Baltic states. The Blue Division's presence carried symbolic value. Spain, officially neutral but sympathetic to the Axis, had contributed the Volunteer Division to demonstrate support for Germany without formally entering the war. For the Soviet Union, the operation was designed to capitalize on the broader strategic momentum following recent victories, as well as to inflict a political and psychological defeat by overrunning a high-profile Axis-aligned foreign unit. The winter conditions added further complexity. Snow and freezing temperatures, with averages near 20 degrees C in February, hindered mobility and created challenges for both attackers and defenders. Ice-covered terrain, frozen rivers, and poor visibility limited armored maneuvering, but allowed infantry to traverse areas otherwise impassable in warmer months. Both sides prepared for the offensive with these conditions in mind. The Soviet command concentrated artillery and mortar batteries to maximize their opening bombardment, while the Spanish and German units improved field fortifications, including trench networks, barbed wire, and reinforced strongpoints along the anticipated axes of attack. By early February 1943, the stage was set for a concentrated clash on a relatively narrow front. Soviet forces massed on the eastern bank of the Izhora River, opposite Krasny Bor, while the Spanish Blue Division, supported by elements of the German 215th Infantry Division, prepared to repel what was expected to be a major thrust. Both sides anticipated that the battle's outcome would influence the broader operational situation around Leningrad, either accelerating the lifting of the siege or reinforcing German control of the sector. In the early hours of 10th of February 1943, the Soviet offensive against the Spanish Blue Division at Krasny Bor commenced with a concentrated artillery barrage. Beginning at 6:45 a.m., over 800 artillery pieces and mortars from the 55th Army unleashed a preparatory bombardment that lasted nearly 2.5 hours, targeting the Spanish forward trenches, command posts, and known strongpoints. Reports indicate that more than 15,000 shells and mortar rounds were fired in this opening phase, creating extensive craters and damaging much of the frontline communications. The bombardment also struck rear areas, including supply depots and medical stations, disrupting the defenders' ability to coordinate reinforcements. The heavy fire was timed to coincide with the low morning visibility and extreme cold, conditions that would complicate counterfire from the German and Spanish batteries positioned further west. At approximately 9:15 a.m., the Soviet infantry and armored formations began their assault across a 12-kilometer sector between the Izhora River and the approaches to the village of Krasny Bor. The main effort was carried by the 45th, 63rd, and 64th Rifle Divisions, supported by tank battalions equipped with around 90 operational T-34 and T-60 tanks. The Soviet advance concentrated particularly on the central and southern stretches of the Blue Division's line, where Spanish units from the 262nd and 263rd Infantry Regiments held hastily fortified positions after recent redeployments. Despite their defensive preparations, many of these positions were overrun during the initial shock, as surviving defenders struggled to re-establish communication following the artillery disruption. The Spanish defenders, numbering roughly 5,600 troops along the immediate front, were forced into fragmented engagements as Soviet rifle battalions exploited breaches between strongpoints. By midday, Soviet spearheads had advanced up to 3 kilometers in some sectors, capturing several hamlets and trench lines on the eastern approaches to Krasny Bor. The 250th Artillery Regiment, positioned behind the main line, provided counter-battery and direct fire support, but their efforts were hampered by ammunition shortages and the disruption caused by the morning bombardment. German elements from the 215th Infantry Division, situated further north, attempted to provide indirect support through coordinated artillery fire, but direct infantry assistance was limited at this stage due to the focus on holding adjacent sectors. Despite the rapid Soviet gains in the opening hours, several fortified positions manned by Spanish companies resisted with unexpected tenacity. At a defensive point known as Position 4, approximately 140 Spanish soldiers held off successive assaults for over 6 hours, inflicting notable losses on the attacking rifle battalions before being outflanked and overwhelmed in the late afternoon. These isolated stands slowed the Soviet timetable and forced some units to divert resources, delaying their projected capture of Krasny Bor by the end of the first day. Casualty estimates for the day indicate that Soviet forces suffered approximately 1,200 killed and wounded in the initial assault, while Spanish and German defenders incurred roughly 1,000 casualties, including both dead and wounded. The coordination of the offensive presented challenges for the Soviet command as well. The frozen terrain and deep snow reduced the mobility of the T-34s and T-60s, forcing many to remain on roads or risk mechanical breakdowns. Several tanks were disabled by mines and anti-tank fire, particularly along the approaches to the main road leading into Krasny Bor. Communication between rifle units and supporting armor was occasionally disrupted due to damaged field lines and the difficulty of moving runners through the snow. These factors slowed the overall pace of the advance, although the Soviet forces maintained their pressure into the evening with continued artillery support and localized assaults on surviving pockets of resistance. By nightfall on 10th of February, Soviet forces had pushed the front line to within 2 kilometers of the village center of Krasny Bor. Several Spanish companies had been encircled and destroyed or captured, while others withdrew to secondary defensive lines west of the main road. The 55th Army's command assessed that the primary objectives for the day, breaching the Spanish line and securing access routes to Tosno, had been partially met but not at the projected speed. Preparations were made to renew the offensive the following morning, with reinforcements moving forward to exploit the breaches created during the initial assault. For the defenders, the night was spent consolidating remaining positions, redistributing ammunition, and awaiting German reinforcements expected to stabilize the collapsing front. On 11th February 1943, the Soviet 55th Army resumed its offensive operations against the Spanish Blue Division's remaining defensive positions around Krasny Bor. At first light, the Soviets launched a renewed artillery preparation, shorter than the previous days but still concentrated, firing approximately 6,000 shells across the Spanish-held line over a 2-hour period. The aim was to weaken the secondary defensive belt west of the main road and to soften the approach into the village center. The Spanish forces, reduced to roughly 3,500 combat-effective soldiers after the previous day's fighting, had reorganized into smaller, ad hoc units composed of remnants from the 262nd and 263rd Infantry Regiments. Their lines now centered around fortified positions within Krasny Bor itself, and several strong points extending toward the Tosno Road. The German command, recognizing the severity of the situation, began rushing forward reserves, including elements of the 212th Infantry Division and additional artillery batteries, but most reinforcements would not arrive before the critical engagements later that day. The Soviet plan for 11th February aimed to break through the remaining Spanish resistance by combining infantry assaults with concentrated armor thrusts, supported by continuous artillery harassment. The 43rd Rifle Brigade and elements of the 63rd Rifle Division were tasked with attacking directly into Krasny Bor from the east and southeast, while tank battalions maneuvered along the more stable road approaches to bypass the worst of the snow and frozen terrain. Soviet forces still had over 70 operational tanks, though mechanical attrition and combat losses had reduced their numbers from the opening day. Supporting fire came from heavy mortars and Katyusha rocket batteries, which struck suspected command posts and rear areas in an effort to disrupt Spanish coordination and morale. The fighting quickly devolved into a series of close-range engagements as Soviet riflemen advanced under covering fire and reached the outer streets of Krasny Bor by mid-morning. Spanish defenders utilized prepared cellars, barricaded houses, and improvised firing positions to contest every approach, employing machine guns, rifles, and limited anti-tank weapons, including German-supplied 50mm and 75mm guns. Several Spanish-held positions successfully repelled Soviet probes, with one documented instance of a company-strength defensive point halting a battalion-level assault for over 3 hours by exploiting overlapping fields of fire and pre-sighted artillery support from the 250th Division's surviving batteries. However, these successes were costly. By noon, many Spanish positions had exhausted their ammunition stocks, and casualties continued to mount, with estimates placing their losses for the day at over 800 killed and wounded. The Soviets also suffered heavily during the house-to-house fighting. Narrow streets, barricades, and concealed anti-tank guns claimed multiple T-34s and T-60s, forcing several units to halt or redirect their advances. Soviet casualty figures for 11 February are estimated at around 1,500 killed and wounded, including significant losses among the rifle units committed to the direct assaults. Despite these setbacks, the weight of Soviet numbers gradually forced the Spanish to yield ground. By late afternoon, the eastern half of Krasny Bor had been captured, and surviving defenders fell back toward a final defensive perimeter near the western outskirts of the village and along the Tosno Road. German attempts to stabilize the front began to materialize in the late afternoon and evening. Forward elements of the 212th Infantry Division, supported by several Sturmgeschütz III assault guns, arrived south of Krasny Bor and began preparing counterattack positions. Their immediate goal was to prevent a full Soviet breakthrough toward Tosno, as the collapse of the Spanish sector threatened to unravel a wider portion of Army Group North's defensive line. The German command also directed additional artillery resources to the sector, including heavy batteries capable of long-range counterfire against Soviet concentrations east of the village. As night fell on 11th of February, the situation for the Blue Division had become critical. Spanish survivors, numbering fewer than 2,500 organized troops, occupied a shrinking defensive arc while relying heavily on German support to hold their positions. Soviet forces, though bloodied, controlled most of Krasny Bor and were preparing to exploit their success by advancing westward the following morning. Both sides anticipated that the next day's fighting would decide the operational fate of the sector. As the 55th Army sought to widen its penetration, and Army Group North scrambled to seal the breach before it threatened the critical Emga rail junction and the approaches to Leningrad. On 12th of February 1943, the battle for Krasny Bor reached its most precarious stage for the Spanish Blue Division as the Soviet 55th Army intensified its efforts to exploit the previous 2 days' gains. The Soviet command, aiming to fully secure the village and advance toward Tosno, committed additional reserves, including fresh battalions from the 72nd Rifle Division and several tank companies drawn from the 31st Tank Brigade. By dawn, Soviet forces on the Krasny Bor sector numbered close to 38,000 troops, supported by roughly 65 operational tanks and over 600 artillery pieces still active along the front. Their immediate operational goal was to complete the destruction of the Blue Division, capture the western approaches to Krasny Bor, and open a corridor for further advances along the Moscow-Leningrad Railway. The Spanish defenders, numbering fewer than 2,200 organized soldiers after the previous day's fighting, were positioned in a compressed defensive perimeter extending west of the village and along key road junctions. These remnants included surviving companies from the 262nd and 263rd Regiments, the Blue Division's anti-tank units, and a handful of field artillery pieces, most of which were short on ammunition. The arrival of German reinforcements on the night of 11th to 12th February, including forward elements of the 212th Infantry Division and a detachment of Sturmgeschütz III assault guns, bolstered the defense. Together, the Spanish and German forces totaled around 6,000 men holding the sector, though the majority were deployed to secure flanks and plug breaches rather than conduct sustained counteroffensives. The Soviet assault began shortly after 7:30 a.m., with another heavy artillery preparation delivering approximately 8,000 shells and mortar rounds across the Spanish and German positions. The bombardment targeted road junctions, artillery emplacements, and known strongpoints west of Krasny Bor, softening the ground for the infantry advance. Within an hour, the 55th Army's rifle units, backed by T-34s and T-60s, advanced along two principal axes, one toward the Tosno Road to threaten the wider Army Group North line, and another directed against the remaining Spanish-held strongpoints on the outskirts of the village. These dual advances sought to fragment the defense and prevent any coordinated counterattack by the German reserves assembling nearby. The fighting throughout the morning was marked by a series of localized counterattacks and delaying actions by the Spanish and German units. The Spanish anti-tank platoons, equipped with a mix of German 37mm and 50mm guns and several captured Soviet pieces, managed to disable or destroy multiple T-34s along the narrow approaches, forcing the Soviet armor to slow its pace. Small groups of Spanish infantry, often numbering fewer than 40 men, occupied fortified dugouts and trenches, holding out against battalion-level assaults long enough for German artillery to reposition and deliver supporting fire. One such strongpoint along the road to Tosno resisted repeated attacks for nearly 8 hours, eventually falling only when Soviet forces brought up heavy mortars and additional armor in the late afternoon. German reinforcements played a growing role as the day progressed. Sturmgeschütz III, assault guns from a battalion attached to the 212th Division, engaged Soviet armor in direct fire duels, destroying several tanks and stabilizing the sector south of Krasny Bor. These actions, combined with concentrated artillery barrages, prevented the Soviets from achieving a full breakthrough toward Tosno, despite capturing several Spanish positions and advancing another 2 kilometers west of the village. Casualty figures for 12th February reflect the ferocity of the fighting. Soviet losses are estimated at 1,800 killed and wounded, while the Spanish and German defenders suffered approximately 1,200 casualties, including over 600 from the Blue Division. By evening, the tactical situation had shifted from a Soviet attempt at a broad penetration to a series of contested, localized engagements. The Spanish Blue Division, now reduced to fewer than 1,600 combat-capable soldiers, continued to hold several key points along the defensive arc, though their ability to sustain the fight was dependent on the growing German presence. The 55th Army prepared to resume attacks the following morning, determined to push through before German reinforcements could fully consolidate. Both sides recognized that the coming day would likely determine whether the Soviets could transform their hard-won foothold into a decisive operational breakthrough, or whether the combined Spanish and German forces could stabilize the front and contain the offensive. On 13th February 1943, the Soviet 55th Army launched its third consecutive day of heavy assaults in the Krasny Bor sector, aiming to achieve the breakthrough that had eluded it despite prior gains. Overnight, additional Soviet reinforcements, including elements of the 34th Rifle Division and tank units from the 220th Separate Tank Brigade, were brought forward to strengthen the offensive along the Tosno Road and to press the remaining Spanish and German defensive positions west of Krasny Bor. By morning, Soviet forces committed to the operation numbered around 40,000 men, with roughly 60 operational tanks, over 500 mortars, and more than 600 artillery pieces concentrated along a narrowing front. Their immediate operational priority was to sever the Tosno Road and force a collapse of the entire defensive line, which would open the path to Maga and compromise Army Group North's logistical network. For the Spanish Blue Division, the situation had grown increasingly dire. After 3 days of intense combat, the division had been reduced to roughly 1,500 effective soldiers, organized into scattered companies and platoons, many lacking heavy weapons or adequate ammunition. Their positions were centered on a series of strongpoints west and northwest of Krasny Bor, anchored by fieldworks hastily improved by retreating troops. The German command, recognizing the importance of holding the line, deployed more elements from the 212th Infantry Division and directed the 11th Infantry Division to prepare for counterattacks further south. Additional assault guns and heavy artillery pieces were also committed, bringing the combined strength of the defenders in the sector to approximately 7,000 men by dawn, though coordination between Spanish remnants and arriving German formations remained a challenge. The Soviet assault began shortly after 8 a.m. with a massed artillery barrage, estimated at nearly 10,000 shells over a 2-hour period, which targeted the remaining Spanish positions, German staging areas, and the Tosno Road itself. This preparatory fire inflicted significant disruption on the defenders, destroying several ammunition dumps and severing lines of communication. Following the bombardment, Soviet rifle divisions advanced along 3 main axes, each supported by armor and close artillery fire. one thrust aimed directly at the Tosno Road, another toward surviving Spanish-held strongpoints, and a third probing southward to prevent German reserves from mounting a coordinated counterstroke. The fighting was marked by increasingly desperate defensive actions. Spanish companies, some reduced to fewer than 30 men, used trenches, cellars, and improvised barricades to delay Soviet advances, often holding out until their positions were overrun by superior numbers and armor. In one sector, a mixed force of Spanish infantry and German assault guns managed to repel two successive Soviet assaults, destroying several T-34s and inflicting notable casualties before withdrawing under cover of artillery fire. However, such local successes were temporary. By midday, Soviet units captured several key junctions along the Tosno Road, forcing German commanders to commit additional reserves to prevent a complete breach. The toll on both sides continued to rise. By the end of 13th February, Soviet casualties for the day are estimated at approximately 1,300 killed and wounded, along with the loss of 15 tanks, to a combination of mines, artillery, and direct anti-tank fire. Spanish and German forces suffered roughly 1,300 casualties, with the Blue Division reduced to fewer than 1,200 combat-capable soldiers. The division's command structure was heavily degraded, with numerous officers killed or wounded, forcing junior leaders to take control of fragmented units. German divisions increasingly assumed operational control of the sector, integrating surviving Spanish elements into their lines to maintain cohesion. As darkness fell, the front stabilized temporarily. Soviet forces had succeeded in pushing the line west of Krasny Bor by another 2 kilometers and had gained partial control of the Tosno Road, but they had not achieved the operational breakthrough necessary to encircle or dislodge Army Group North from the region. German reserves, though limited, were beginning to solidify their positions, and the deteriorated state of the Blue Division meant its role was shifting from frontline defense to supporting German formations as auxiliary infantry. The Soviet 55th Army prepared for continued pressure, confident that attrition and sustained attacks would eventually fracture the remaining defenses, while Army Group North's command assessed whether to hold the current line or prepare for a gradual withdrawal to more defensible positions further west. On 14th of February 1943, the struggle for control of the Krasny Bor sector intensified as the Soviet 55th Army sought to capitalize on its incremental gains from the previous days and finally secure a breakthrough toward Tosno and Maga overnight. Soviet command brought forward additional artillery ammunition, engineer units, and fresh rifle battalions from its reserves to maintain the offensive tempo. The 34th and 72nd Rifle Divisions, supported by the remnants of the 43rd Rifle Brigade, were tasked with continuing the main effort along the Tosno Road, while the 63rd Rifle Division concentrated on pressing the remaining Spanish and German positions along the western approaches to Krasny Bor itself. In total, approximately 42,000 Soviet troops remained committed to the operation, backed by about 55 operational tanks and over 550 artillery pieces. Though losses had been severe, the Soviet command remained determined to achieve the operational objectives before German reinforcements could fully consolidate the defensive line. The defenders, now consisting of roughly 1,000 surviving soldiers from the Spanish Blue Division and approximately 6,500 German troops from the 212th Infantry Division, were under constant strain. The Spanish elements, badly depleted and suffering from severe ammunition shortages, were largely integrated into German-held sectors as auxiliary infantry, filling gaps and manning secondary positions. German units, bolstered by additional artillery and a small detachment of assault guns, worked to establish a series of fallback positions west of the Tosno Road, preparing for the possibility of a staged withdrawal should the Soviet pressure become untenable. Army Group North's command emphasized the necessity of holding the sector at least until more reserves from the 11th Infantry Division and additional armored support could arrive. The day's combat began with a pre-dawn Soviet artillery bombardment, delivering over 9,000 shells onto the defenders' forward and rear areas. The barrage was aimed not only at softening resistance, but also at disrupting supply and reinforcement efforts, as German logistical columns had been moving forward overnight to stabilize the sector. At 7:30 a.m., Soviet rifle battalions advanced under the cover of the bombardment, supported by tank units along the main road approaches. Engineer teams followed closely to clear minefields and construct makeshift crossings over damaged terrain, enabling the continued movement of armor despite the snow and ice. Despite the intensity of the Soviet assault, the German-Spanish defense managed to slow the advance through coordinated artillery strikes and counterattacks. Concentrated fire from German heavy batteries, including 150mm howitzers, inflicted significant losses on Soviet troop concentrations and destroyed several tanks attempting to cross exposed ground. In one sector, a combined force of Spanish riflemen and German assault guns launched a counterattack that retook a small but critical road junction, delaying the Soviet advance for several hours. However, these actions came at a steep cost, with the Spanish suffering another 200 casualties during the counterstroke and subsequent withdrawal. By midday, Soviet forces had advanced another 1.5 kilometers along the Tosno Road, capturing several fortified positions and forcing the defenders to fall back to pre-prepared secondary lines. Casualty estimates for 14th and February indicate that Soviet forces lost approximately 1,700 killed and wounded, along with 8 tanks disabled or destroyed. The defenders, Spanish and German combined, suffered around 1,000 casualties, with the Blue Division's remaining effective strength dropping below 800 men. Command cohesion within the Spanish ranks had further eroded, with surviving officers now functioning primarily as liaisons with the German divisional command to coordinate their scattered units. As evening approached, the front stabilized along a hastily organized line, anchored by German infantry, supported by artillery and the surviving assault guns. The Soviet 55th Army, though still possessing considerable numerical superiority, faced increasing logistical strain as ammunition consumption rose and supply lines became stretched across snow-covered and damaged roads. The failure to achieve a decisive breakthrough, despite 4 days of heavy fighting, raised concerns within the Soviet High Command about the sustainability of the offensive, particularly given the mounting casualties and mechanical attrition of their armored units. By the end of 14th February, both sides prepared for the likelihood of continued combat, though the nature of the engagement was beginning to shift. The Soviets remained intent on pressing forward to achieve their operational goals, while the German command, with the Blue Division now functioning as a fragmented auxiliary force, focused on consolidating the line and preparing countermeasures. The cumulative attrition was becoming a central factor, with the battle evolving into a contest of endurance as much as maneuver. On 15th February 1943, the battle for Krasny Bor entered a phase defined by attrition and incremental maneuvers rather than sweeping advances. The Soviet 55th Army, having expended significant manpower and material over 5 days of constant assaults, shifted its focus to sustained pressure rather than risking further heavy losses through large-scale frontal attacks. Soviet strength in the sector had been reduced to approximately 38,000 combat-capable troops after cumulative casualties, with around 50 operational tanks and roughly 500 artillery pieces still available for support. Commanders concentrated on consolidating captured ground, securing supply routes to the forward lines, and preparing smaller coordinated assaults aimed at wearing down the defenders and probing for exploitable weaknesses rather than achieving an immediate breakthrough. For the defenders, the strain was equally acute. The Spanish Blue Division, now numbering fewer than 700 effective soldiers, had ceased to function as a cohesive formation. Its remnants were divided among German sectors, primarily serving as static infantry for manning trenches and secondary positions. The bulk of the defensive burden fell to the 212th Infantry Division, reinforced by elements of the 11th Infantry Division, several batteries of heavy artillery, and a detachment of assault guns. Combined German and Spanish strength in the sector totaled roughly 8,000 troops, but these forces were spread across a front of over 10 kilometers, making local concentrations difficult and counterattacks limited in scope. The day's engagements began with a series of Soviet probing attacks in the early morning, supported by localized artillery strikes rather than the massive barrages of previous days. These thrusts, involving company and battalion-sized units, aimed to test the resilience of German positions along the Tosno Road and to identify weak points where future concentrated efforts could be launched. In several instances, Soviet infantry managed to infiltrate forward trench lines, forcing German defenders to call down artillery fire on their own abandoned positions to prevent further penetration. However, each gain was met by rapid counterfire and localized counterattacks, preventing any significant Soviet advances. Spanish remnants, despite their depleted numbers, continued to play a role in delaying actions. Small groups, often fewer than 20 men, occupied isolated dugouts and strongpoints, forcing Soviet units to commit disproportionate resources to clear them. In one notable instance, a Spanish platoon held a fortified position for over 6 hours, repelling multiple assaults before withdrawing under cover of darkness, allowing German engineers to mine the approaches and fortify the line behind them. These delaying actions, while costly, disrupted the Soviet timetable and added to the cumulative toll of the offensive. By midday, the Soviets shifted their efforts toward consolidating captured sectors and fortifying their own forward positions. Engineers constructed dugouts and anti-tank defenses, while supply units worked to move ammunition and fuel forward across snow-clogged and damaged roads. The 55th Army's commanders recognized that the prolonged fighting had strained their logistics, with several frontline units experiencing shortages of mortar shells and medical supplies. Soviet casualty figures for 15th of February are estimated at roughly 1,000 killed and wounded, while German and Spanish losses totaled around 600, including a significant proportion of the remaining Blue Division personnel. The afternoon saw limited German counteroffensive activity, as elements of the 11th Infantry Division conducted a small-scale counterattack along the southern flank, supported by assault guns and heavy artillery. This thrust recaptured several minor positions and inflicted additional losses on the Soviet 72nd Rifle Division, but its scope was intentionally limited to avoid overextension. The counterattack allowed German forces to straighten their defensive line and establish a more cohesive front, reducing the number of exposed salients vulnerable to Soviet artillery. By the evening of 15th of February, the pace of combat had slowed, though artillery exchanges and small unit skirmishes persisted along the entire sector. The Blue Division's combat role had effectively transitioned to that of a support contingent for the German divisions, its remnants dispersed and integrated to bolster the thinly held line. Both sides were now operating under the constraints of attrition, with the Soviets attempting to conserve strength for future efforts, while the defenders focused on maintaining cohesion and buying time for reinforcements and resupply. The character of the battle was shifting toward a prolonged contest of endurance rather than a single decisive engagement, with the operational outcome still uncertain. On 16 February 1943, the confrontation at Krasny Bor transitioned into a series of controlled offensives and defensive adjustments, as neither side was in a position to deliver a decisive blow. The Soviet 55th Army, reduced by attrition to around 35,000 combat-ready troops, maintained its offensive posture but moderated the scale of its assaults. Its operational focus shifted toward tightening control over captured areas, extending its flanks along the Tosno Road, and launching limited thrusts to incrementally push the German line westward. Approximately 45 tanks, many suffering from mechanical wear after a week of fighting, remained operational, supported by 480 artillery pieces. Ammunition rationing began to influence the planning of barrages, as the daily consumption of shells had surpassed the resupply rate due to the poor condition of supply roads across the frozen, cratered terrain. The defenders, now under consolidated German command, continued to hold a defensive line extending west and southwest of Krasny Bor, anchored by the 212th and 11th Infantry Divisions, with the remnants of the Blue Division, fewer than 600 men, dispersed among various sectors as auxiliary infantry. Combined strength totaled around 8,500 troops, supported by a modest but crucial force of 14 Sturmgeschütz III assault guns and over 300 artillery pieces, including several heavy batteries positioned further to the rear. These resources allowed the defense to deliver effective counter-battery fire and mobile anti-tank responses, despite the thinly stretched infantry along the line. The priority for Army Group North's local command was to preserve control over the Tosno Road and prevent the Soviet forces from achieving a penetration deep enough to threaten the Emga rail junction. The morning began with targeted Soviet artillery strikes, limited to roughly 4,500 shells, aimed at softening German positions on the western approaches to Krasny Bor and along the Tosno Road. Instead of massed infantry assaults, the Soviets sent out company-sized reconnaissance-in-force operations, supported by small groups of tanks, to probe for weaknesses. Several of these thrusts achieved temporary penetrations, with one Soviet detachment advancing nearly a kilometer into a lightly held sector before being repelled by concentrated artillery fire and a counterattack by German infantry supported by assault guns. These engagements highlighted the diminishing scale of the Soviet attacks, which now prioritized positional gains rather than breakthrough attempts. Throughout the day, defensive resilience relied heavily on artillery and mobile countermeasures. German heavy batteries, including 150 mm and 210 mm guns, delivered sustained fire on Soviet assembly areas, disrupting two planned assaults before they could fully form. Spanish remnants, though few in number, manned secondary trenches and forward observation posts, directing fire and delaying Soviet advances at key junctions. In one engagement, a Spanish detachment of 25 men held a trench network for several hours, enabling German engineers to lay additional mines along a vulnerable stretch of road, ultimately destroying two Soviet T-34s during an afternoon skirmish. Casualties on 16 February were notably lower than in prior days, but remained significant due to constant skirmishing and artillery exchanges. Soviet losses are estimated at roughly 800 killed and wounded, along with the destruction or disablement of 6 tanks, primarily through mines and assault gun fire. German and Spanish forces suffered approximately 500 casualties, with the Blue Division's effective strength falling below 500 men, most of them serving as rear area guards or ammunition carriers rather than frontline fighters. By late afternoon, the Soviet 55th Army shifted focus toward consolidating its positions rather than pressing further attacks. Engineer units fortified newly captured ground with trenches and anti-tank emplacements, while logistics teams worked to stabilize supply flows over the damaged road network. Soviet commanders began reassessing the feasibility of continuing large-scale operations, given the mounting costs and the failure to achieve the planned breakthrough toward Tosno. Meanwhile, the German command continued reinforcing the line with additional artillery and prepared for potential counteroffensive actions should Soviet momentum stall completely. As night fell on 16th February, the battlefront stabilized into a tense but relatively static state. Both sides maintained active artillery duels and patrols, but the intensity of the fighting had diminished compared to the earlier days. The Blue Division, effectively reduced to a symbolic force, now played only a marginal tactical role. The wider contest centered on whether the Soviet 55th Army could sustain pressure long enough to fracture Army Group North's line, or whether German reinforcements and a shift in operational posture would secure the sector and halt the offensive. The struggle was evolving into a battle of endurance and logistical resilience, with neither side yet willing to cede ground despite the cumulative toll. On 17 February 1943, the fighting in the Krasny Bor sector continued to evolve into a slower, attritional contest, as the Soviet 55th Army persisted in its attempts to push the German line back, while avoiding the losses that had characterized the earlier stages of the offensive. The Soviet force, which had started the operation with over 44,000 men, was now reduced to approximately 33,000 combat-capable troops. Tank strength had declined to around 40 operational vehicles, with mechanical failures and mine damage accounting for a significant portion of the losses, and artillery strength stood near 450 pieces. Commanders focused on maintaining steady pressure through artillery, reconnaissance in force operations, and localized infantry pushes rather than full-scale assaults. The operational goal was now to solidify control of the ground already taken, extend defensive flanks, and wear down the defenders sufficiently to enable a larger attack once reinforcements and supplies could be re-established. For the German and Spanish defenders, the day was marked by continued consolidation of their line and limited countermeasures to disrupt Soviet advances. Combined German strength, now bolstered by more units from the 11th Infantry Division and supported by assault guns and additional heavy artillery, stood at roughly 9,000 troops across the sector. The remnants of the Blue Division, numbering about 450 men, were almost entirely reassigned to rear area and auxiliary roles, manning observation posts, assisting with ammunition distribution, and reinforcing thinly held trench lines under German control. The defensive line, though shortened to roughly 8 kilometers, remained vulnerable due to the limited infantry density and constant artillery harassment. The day began with a concentrated Soviet artillery bombardment, though at a scale reduced compared to earlier phases, with approximately 5,000 shells delivered across suspected command posts, road junctions, and artillery positions. This fire was followed by a series of battalion-sized assaults launched by elements of the 63rd and 72nd Rifle Divisions along the Tosno Road and the northern approaches to the sector. These attacks, supported by small groups of T-34s, advanced cautiously, probing German positions rather than seeking deep penetrations. While a few forward trenches changed hands during the morning, the German defense, heavily reliant on pre-registered artillery fire and mobile assault guns, managed to contain each push. A notable engagement occurred near a fortified roadblock on the Tosno route, where a Soviet force of 2 rifle companies, supported by 5 tanks, attempted to seize a German strongpoint controlling a key junction. The defenders, including a platoon of Spanish riflemen integrated with German infantry and backed by 2 Sturmgeschütz III vehicles, held their ground for nearly 4 hours. They destroyed 3 T-34s through coordinated anti-tank fire and forced the Soviet infantry to withdraw after incurring over 150 casualties. This defense, though costly for the Germans and Spanish, prevented a potential Soviet envelopment of a vulnerable sector and demonstrated the continuing tactical value of the surviving Blue Division personnel when integrated into German command structures. Casualties on 17th February continued to accumulate. Soviet forces suffered approximately 900 killed and wounded, along with the loss of 4 tanks due to mines, artillery, and direct fire. German and Spanish defenders incurred around 600 casualties, primarily from sustained artillery bombardments and close-quarters fighting in contested trenches. While both sides experienced significant strain, The ability of German heavy artillery and assault guns to respond effectively to Soviet probes allowed the defense to maintain cohesion despite ongoing pressure. By the afternoon, the pace of combat slowed as both sides focused on fortifying their positions. Soviet engineers expanded trench networks and anti-tank defenses, while German units reinforced key junctions with additional barbed wire, minefields, and concealed artillery placements. The operational tempo reflected the recognition by both commands that a decisive outcome was unlikely in the immediate term without significant reinforcement or a shift in strategy. As darkness fell on 17th of February, the battlefront remained essentially static, with the Soviets holding most of Krasny Bor and the approaches east of the Tosno Road, while German and integrated Spanish forces maintained control over the road itself and key defensive positions to its west. The 55th Army's commanders weighed whether to continue pressing with their diminished strength or pause to regroup for a larger offensive, while Army Group North worked to move additional reserves into the sector. The struggle was now centered as much on logistics and endurance as on maneuver, with each day's outcome measured by small territorial shifts and casualty balances rather than decisive operational movements. By 18 February 1943, the Battle of Krasny Bor had transitioned fully from an offensive push to a grueling phase of positional warfare. As both the Soviet 55th Army and the German forces, including the remnants of the Spanish Blue Division, reached the limits of their operational endurance. The Soviet force, which had begun the offensive 8 days earlier with over 44,000 troops, was now reduced to roughly 31,000 combat-ready soldiers. Tank numbers had dropped to around 35 operational vehicles, and artillery strength, though still formidable at approximately 430 pieces, was constrained by ammunition shortages and the logistical strain of supplying the front through damaged and snow-clogged roads. Commanders began limiting their daily artillery expenditures, prioritizing counter-battery fire and defensive preparation over massed bombardments. German forces, bolstered by continued reinforcements from the 11th Infantry Division and supported by the 212th Infantry Division, held a defensive line anchored along the Tosno Road and west of Krasny Bor. Their combined strength stood at about 9,500 troops, including artillery and support units. The Blue Division, effectively shattered as a cohesive formation, counted fewer than 400 combat-capable soldiers, most assigned to man observation posts, deliver supplies, or bolster thinly manned trench lines. German commanders maintained their focus on preserving control of the Tosno Road and preventing the Soviets from achieving a penetration that could threaten the Emga rail junction and disrupt Army Group North's logistical network. Combat on 18th of February was defined by small-scale engagements and persistent artillery duels rather than major assaults. The Soviets launched several company and battalion-sized probes along the Tosno Road and the northern flank, supported by short, localized artillery strikes. One such engagement occurred near a rail embankment south of Krasny Bor, where two Soviet rifle companies, supported by 4 T-34s, attempted to dislodge a German defensive position reinforced by a platoon of Spanish infantry. The attack was repelled after a 3-hour firefight, with 2 tanks destroyed by mines and coordinated anti-tank fire. The defenders suffered 40 casualties, but the position held, underscoring the resilience of the joint German-Spanish defense despite their cumulative losses. Soviet operations increasingly focused on consolidating their territorial gains and fortifying forward positions rather than seeking immediate breakthroughs. Engineers expanded trench networks, laid additional minefields, and prepared fallback lines, while artillery units targeted German supply routes and staging areas to hinder reinforcement efforts. Soviet commanders weighed the costs of continuing the offensive against the strategic imperative of relieving pressure on Leningrad and securing a more defensible perimeter south of the city. With the 55th Army's casualties over the course of the battle, estimated at more than 11,000 killed and wounded, and the loss of over 50 tanks, the prospect of a decisive penetration without additional reinforcements was diminishing. For the defenders, the day was marked by continued efforts to stabilize their line and absorb the remaining Spanish forces into German formations. Casualty estimates for 18 February placed German and Spanish losses at approximately 500, with the Blue Division nearing exhaustion as an operational entity. Army Group North's command began planning to rotate surviving Spanish troops out of the front lines entirely, recognizing their diminished combat effectiveness after losing more than 70% of their initial strength during the 8 days of fighting. German artillery and assault guns remained the cornerstone of the defensive effort, compensating for thin infantry density by delivering rapid counterfire against Soviet assembly areas and armored thrusts. By evening, the front had stabilized into a stalemate. The Soviets retained control of Krasny Bor and the ground captured east of the Tosno Road, but they had failed to achieve their broader objective of breaking through to Muga and dislodging Army Group North from its positions south of Leningrad. The German line, though strained, held firm along the Tosno corridor, preserving a vital logistical artery and preventing a Soviet envelopment of the sector. The remnants of the Blue Division, despite catastrophic losses, had contributed significantly to delaying the Soviet advance during the critical opening days, buying the time necessary for German reinforcements to secure the sector. In the aftermath of the battle, both sides assessed their positions carefully. For the Soviets, the engagement represented a costly partial success. Krasny Bor had been taken and some territorial gains achieved, but at the cost of heavy casualties and without delivering the decisive operational results sought by the Leningrad Front's command. For the Germans, the defense had succeeded in preventing a strategic breakthrough, but at the expense of the near destruction of the Blue Division and significant attrition among their reinforcing units. The battle marked the end of large-scale Soviet offensives in the sector for several weeks, as both sides turned to fortifying their lines and preparing for the next phase of the campaign around Leningrad.